we don't run 2 at a time. Can you guys hear me okay? I'm kind of quiet, so just tell me to speak up. Okay. So I'm Dr. Emily Wilson, and I'm one of the AMBO vets here at Loomis, and I do a lot of acupuncture, some chiropractic, performance horse stuff, as well as like the general practice stuff. I'm a rider myself as well, and so the saddle fit has kind of become a big part of my life outside of my vet life, but also as far as, you know, lameness and things like that, it really plays a bigger role than I think a lot of people realize. And so this is kind of just like, I could talk for hours on saddles, so this is like a basic things for you guys to go home, check out with your saddles, look on your horse, just to give you guys an idea of, you know, because I have so many people ask, even on the phone, how do I know if my saddle fits or not? Things to look for. So that's kind of what we're going to go over today with our lovely model. Here we have Paul and Gus, he's a very good boy, so we'll see how he looks in the dressage saddle. He's probably never had one on before. So the big thing to start with is, why is this so important for horses? You know, they're big, strong animals. You know, most of them only get ridden an hour or so, maybe, you know, 4 or 5 times a week. What is the big deal about this? So, it's in an area that it's connecting the hind end to the front end. So a normal horse, their normal biomechanics for them to trot off across the pasture, you know, quote unquote correctly, a pain-free horse, they've got to contract their abs, lift their back, and ideally push from behind. You've all seen horses that kind of pull themselves along, but theoretically the normal horse should push. So there's a diagram on, I think, the second page in here that kind of gives you an idea of that visualization. And I would say most disciplines, that's, you know, the ideal thing we're looking for. We're looking for the horse to be able to lift its back, push from behind, get some impulsion, and move forward like that. And it works in a circular pattern. So you can imagine if something hurts or is pinching in this middle area, all this power that they're creating behind it has nowhere to go. And it's like us. If your back's sore, you know, you kind of walk around with your back hollowed out. They do the same thing. There's horses, you can look out in the pasture, and they're standing there with their back hollowed out, you know, all camped out, things like that. So they have postures that they do to show pain as well, just like we do. And the big thing is that over time, I mean, we all want a sound horse. That's, you know, we all want to be able to ride. It's important. We love it. It keeps us sane. It's my therapy, so I love to be able to get out. And when they have a poor fitting saddle that causes either back pain, it changes that ideal biomechanics of how the horse moves. So all of a sudden now we have, you'll notice, you know, in some horses they tend to go more out behind. They have a hard time bringing their hind legs up underneath them, because instead of being able to lift their back, they can't now because it hurts. So they're trying to get away from the pain. So that puts a lot more pressure on stifles, hocks, tendons, and ligaments. So all of a sudden you're now adding extra stress to these areas that can cause a lot of lameness. So, you know, when people say, oh, it's just the saddle, it's really the whole horse. And I kind of look at it as like a preventative measure, in hopes that if you've got things that, you know, we're trying to keep the whole horse sound and going, allowing them to be able to use themselves as best they can. So what do we look for? A lot of you guys probably know this as well. The physical things that we're looking for that may indicate, you know, either old saddle issues. You know, a lot of people, clients of mine, have rescues and they say, you know, what are these white hairs? So we're looking for color changes in the withers or shoulders area. A lot of times if it's old, they'll get white hairs. So you always want to keep an eye on, you know, are there new things coming? Is my horse changing color there? You know, obviously in the extreme cases, we'll get sores. You can see friction rubs where, you know, I'll have people comment like, well, the hair's just much flatter here at the back of the saddle, or the back of the saddle pad. Also looking at muscling, we're looking for atrophy at any point along the saddle area. So some horses will have more atrophy at their withers depending on saddle fit issues, or even all the way back here over their caudal thoracic area. You'll notice, you look at some horses and there's like a big divot here, you know, side to side symmetry. All of those things are good indications as to, okay, there's potentially an issue. The other thing too is when you pull your saddle off, just take a second to look. What does the sweat pattern look like on my horse's back? Are there big dry spots? Is it really nice and even? Dry spots can indicate different things, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, but it's just to give you guys kind of an idea, okay, hey, maybe something's going on that I need to check out. And it's not always got to get rid of the saddle and go buy a new one, because I I have a lot of clients that are like, oh God, please don't tell me it doesn't fit, because you know it's expensive. They're an expensive investment, but there are things that we can do to kind of help. Either, you know, there are some saddles that just don't work for certain horses, but at least you guys kind of get an idea. And then some horses, it's just vague behavioral problems. They don't stand still when they're tied, they get really grumpy when they know it's time to get saddled, things like that. There are, you know, just those grumpy horses that have been there and that's their personality. There are horses too that the only thing they show is just hypersensitivity to grooming. You know, you brush them in that area and they dip out of the way, or they try and bite you. And then I think probably the vast majority of issues are subtle saddle issues that show up as performance problems. So, you know, if you're a dressage rider, you know, the complaint is, look, I'm just not getting as much suspension as I, you know, usually do or used to do, or we're having a harder, you know, time turning for the roping horses, or barrel horses are actually another one. You know, I'm having a really hard time turning one direction. So those are kind of the subtle ones. Obviously rearing, not wanting to go forward, bucking, those all may be, all of those issues are worthwhile to take a peek at your saddle and see what's going on. So just some basic anatomy, and I'm going to try, you guys are kind of all, I know, hi buddy, just to give you guys kind of an outline. So their scapula sits kind of right here. So a lot of people don't realize that this top part of the scapula is all cartilage up here, and that's where a lot of saddle issues come from. This shoulder has to be able to move. So when he's trotting along, if something's pushing on here, it's going to be really uncomfortable for him. And that's where I get a lot of horses that don't want to go forward, because they know as soon as they start going, or they're fine at the walk, they start trotting and it bangs up there. The withers area, breed-wise, you can look at Scout's withers are different than Gus's. Some horses have no withers. There's this kind of triangle that I talk about sometimes that's basically here, and I kind of equate it to like our traps in the back here. If anybody's had like trigger points or sensitivity there, it's a very sensitive area. There's a lot of nerves, there's a lot of sensitive small muscle fibers, so we don't want to put pressure right here. So if you have a horse, you know, one of the things you can check is you can squeeze on their withers and see. A normal horse that's not having saddle issues or, you know, underlying wither issues, they don't really care about that for the most part. So that's a really important area to look at as well. And then their spine, their thoracic spine here, these are dorsal, so the bumps you feel along their back, and in some horses we don't feel them because they're a little rounder. These are their dorsal spinous processes. So the spine itself is much lower, but this is just bone right here. So there's nothing protecting this. So we don't want the saddle sitting high. You got an itch? I'm in your way? Oh, there's a fly. One fly. Sorry, guys. We don't want any pinching or any pressure on the actual spine itself, because there's nothing to protect it. So sometimes we'll see swelling along here, so things to just keep in mind. And then ideally, we want their spine to have a nice little, you know, area on either side where there's freedom, because we're going to be asking these horses to turn. We don't just go in straight lines. At least most of us don't. At some point you got to turn around to come home. And the muscling along here is really where we want the saddle to sit and put the pressure on to distribute the weight for us. So these are things that, just for you guys to go home, every horse is different, so it's important for you to kind of know what's normal for your horse and animal, so that, you know, you can pick up on kind of subtle abnormalities, because there's usually not like a big flashing sign that says, you know, okay, today my saddle no longer fits. So one of the things I'm going to just talk about really briefly, because a lot of us buy used saddles, it's just really important, and I think most of us don't do it. I didn't for a long time. I didn't really realize what could be wrong. Is just looking at, before you ever put it on your horse, the construction of the saddle. So one of the things that I do and tell people to do if they're going saddle shopping is, it's the same thing with the Western one, but I'll just show you guys on this. You want to make sure the tree's not broken. I can't tell you how many painful horses are out there because the tree's broken in the saddle and nobody knows. It can also just be that it's a weak spot. So the trees, there's a variety. There are wood trees out there. There's tons of synthetic materials. So if you put the saddle up against you and you pull it towards you, there should be no wrinkles in the seat showing up. If you have wrinkles, you either have a weak spot in your tree or there's a broken spot in the tree. And you can imagine how uncomfortable that is for that horse when you sit on it and then ask them to go to work. So particularly used saddles, just check it out. It takes 2 seconds. And oftentimes this happens when either a horse may flip over, or if you've ever had a young horse or any horse that decides you tack it up and it goes and rolls, check your saddle, because they're big animals, and if they roll all the way over, they can break the tree. So the other big area, and the Western saddle doesn't necessarily have, you know, panels per se, but I'll show you on that one. So the other thing to look at is what the panels look like. How are they stuffed? Are there flat areas? Are there depressions? Are they even side to side, or are they asymmetrical? Some panels, they can be filled with different things. Wool, there's some fleece ones, there's synthetic, foam. So you want to make sure this is nice and even, and that it's not overstuffed. It shouldn't look like, you know, kind of a balloon, and you shouldn't be able to pinch the leather. That tells me, okay, it's probably understuffed, or everything inside has been compressed down. And the panels can make a big difference as far as, you know, those common areas that we see further in the back where they get sore. A lot of times, if you just take a second and look at your panels, there can be hard spots where the flockings all come together. So it's a really easy way to kind of just look at the basic things. For the Western saddle, you can check the tree as well. The big thing too is to make sure that your wool and the fleece on the bottom doesn't have big holes in it, because that will change. That's now an area that's not in contact with your horse. So, you know, I always kind of tell people, check that out, you know, before you stick it on your horse, and it's just a good way to get some extra info so you know what you're starting with. Okay, let's see. So, the first thing I do is static evaluation. It's, you know, easy for you guys to do at home. One of the things that I'm just going to show you guys real fast. Can you put your head up, sir? Like, I'm really itchy today. So remember where that shoulder is with him standing? So when I bring his leg forward, this is all shifted down and back. So you can imagine when he's trotting along, can you guys see that shoulder blade move? So that's what's happening under your saddle. So I say static exam first, but it's really important to do a dynamic exam as well. So we'll see how cute he looks in his dressage saddle. Sorry, Gus. He's like, this is so embarrassing. Okay. I'm sorry. Can you guys all see relatively okay? Okay. So one of the things I first look at is step back, look at the saddle. How does it look on the horse? Are you just noticing that it's sitting up with the front forward? Are you noticing sitting with the front down? So that may give you an idea of tree width and how appropriate it is for that horse. So when you're looking at a saddle and it's sitting up like this, the nose is kind of up, that to me indicates that likely the tree is too narrow for the horse. So it's sitting up in that kind of sensitive area in the triangle. If you have a saddle that's kind of tipped down like this, the tree's probably a little bit too wide, because now it's sitting further down. And a lot of times that's when we run into it's sitting on the actual shoulder itself. This shoulder has got to move, and without it getting impinged. So same thing with the Western saddle. Check it out that way. The other thing that I look at is, okay, how much room do I have here between their withers and the front of the saddle? Can I fit 2 hands in there? Can I fit 1 finger? They've got to have clearance in their withers. If there's a ton of clearance, usually those are the saddles that are tipped up a little bit, and the tree's probably a little bit narrow, because all of a sudden you've lifted the saddle up. It's not fitting their back correctly. So make sure they've got nice clearance. Then what I like to do is stand behind them, if it's a nice horse, which Gus is, and look at the gullet clearance. So we were talking about how there's nothing protecting the top of their spine. I like to see a good at least 3/4 of an inch on either side of their spine where that channel can go, because we don't go in straight lines. So they've got to be able to turn without, you know, feeling impingement. And like some people will complain, the horse is great in a straight line, and as soon as I get to that corner in the dressage court, he gets really pissy and grumpy and has a hard time coming from behind. Okay, check your saddle. Just make sure that they have enough clearance, because when he goes to turn, he's got to round his spine, And if something is pinching him, then you need to be able to know that. So I also like to check without the girth on whether it rocks at all. One of the things that can happen is, if it's either overstuffed in the middle or doesn't quite fit them, you'll get an instability, which most people notice when they actually go to get on the horse. The other thing is I like to run my hand between the front of the saddle and down to figure out shoulder clearance. So he's got a big shoulder. This saddle doesn't really fit him. So you can see, my hand kind of gets stuck every time right here. And check both sides, because usually there's very few horses that are 100% symmetrical. Most of them tend to be more kind of left-sided dominant muscling wise. So check that, because that's a big thing as far as comfort. Those horses that don't want to go forward, if their shoulders are pinched, it's really uncomfortable. The other thing is we want to make sure that the panels are in even contact along the back of the horse. There are some philosophies out there that you want potentially a little bit of bridging, like say in a dressage horse, so that they can really lift and round their back and they're not hitting that wall of saddle when they go to really lift. It's a balance, it's a fine line. I would say for your average horse and your average saddle, you want a fairly even contact from here to here on the panel. So I like to check that. I run my hand under and see, my hand shouldn't get stuck along the way, and there shouldn't be air. So when I have a saddle that's bridging, it puts pressure here. Are you leaving us? And here, and then there's air here. You'll run your hand under, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, I can move my hand in here. There's a hole. The opposite of that, especially with some jump saddles, depending on how the horses are built, the back will actually come up just a little bit. Like when you put it on the horse, you'll kind of notice there's like a little bit of air in back. We call that kind of like a banana shaped, I'm not sure there's a technical term for that. But then you can imagine when somebody actually sits in the saddle, it's going to push this down, and then the front of the saddle is actually going to come up a little bit. So that's kind of a different pattern, but also something to keep an eye on. The bridging pattern is probably, I would say, a very common thing to see to varying degrees. The thing you'll notice is you pull your saddle off after, and there's like big dry spots because either the horse, there's nothing in contact there, or sometimes we'll see dry spots up here because there's so much pressure. So the dry spots don't necessarily tell you exactly what's going on, but it gives you an idea that there's an issue. So let's see how off course I've got now. Okay, and then all of these things still apply to the Western saddle. I will say one of the things that is really important in the Western saddle, because they tend to have, these nice skirts and things like that, and sometimes we're trying to fit them on really little horses. You have to make sure the skirt length doesn't come too far back. I have some barrel horses that, even in a shorter skirted saddle, when they go to turn really hard, like, people say, we're going in great, and then all of a sudden the horse is like, whoa, what happened? And then they come out. But you just have to make sure that this skirt doesn't hit them, in the point of their hip here, or even in this flank area, if you're doing a lot of sports where you're really turning. Yes?
Could you put that Western saddle on him? I have a horse with a large shoulder, and I want to see what kind of position you put that in.
So this doesn't leave him a lot of clearance here. This is not his saddle.
How much clearance should there be? I've heard like 4 fingers this way.
Yeah, I would say on your average horse, like to me, I could fit 2 vertical on him. So to me, that's too close. And the other thing I will say is do your static exam, but then get on them. You riding them is also part of the saddle fit exam. So what I've had people do is when they get on and ride them, when you're trotting along, put your fingers in here and make sure you can still feel a gap, because if you're posting or something like that, you might have good clearance. When you just look at it, I can see daylight.
You're doing all that with no pad?
I usually at the time that I get on, I will usually put on the pad that I'm using. Some people will ride without pads, at all, and kind of look at the imprint of the saddle and like the sweat lines that way. Everybody does it a little bit differently. I usually at that point clients have, the horses tacked up and we kind of watch them go that way. So yeah, to me, like this is pushing on his shoulder right
Should
here.
that be behind his saddle? Should it be actually behind his shoulder?
So the pressure point should be. So this saddle in particular puts too much pressure on his shoulder
Is
for
it
what
too
I'd
long
like to
for
see.
his back as well?
Yeah. So this is like the other thing. For him, if he's going in a straight line, it's probably fine. If I'm asking him to, be really handy and turn corners and things like that, this may get him right here, and that's not super comfortable for them. So
How do you determine how far back the saddle should be?
So weight bearing wise, the saddle there should be no weight bearing pressure past the 18th rib. So the skirt can go beyond there, and each horse is different. So the long backed horse, this might be totally fine, might not bother him at all. But yeah, so find the last rib and come up, and that's where the last weight bearing portion should be of that saddle. Does that help?
But the skirt can go beyond
The
that.
skirt can go beyond. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. But
As long as it's not hitting the hip.
yep, exactly. And it's just something to, and some of these skirts on the older saddles, they're a little bit tighter. If you get a really round horse, they'll actually get rubs, here if the pad doesn't come all the way back. And some people will notice with the Western saddles, they'll get kind of like a swelling back here because the back of that saddle tips, like if you're doing a lot of hills and things like that. And that's actually another really important thing with the Western saddles is if you're getting, because it's a much bigger saddle, it's over a bigger surface area. So if you're doing a lot of hill work or even a lot of turning, and as a rider you feel like that saddle is moving and shifting, or you're getting swelling back here, one of the things to try is a back cinch to try and stabilize the back of the saddle. So some people, that works really well. Obviously your horse needs to be used to it, so don't just strap it on and get on if they've never had one on before. But that can really help the Western saddles. Yes.
I have a pad that seems to shift under the saddle, and the pad goes down on the withers, even though when I saddle, I really
pull
pull
it
the
up.
pad up.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that's a saddle not fitting properly, or
Sometimes when that happens, there's actually too much room, where there's a lot of shifting. There are some horses that just have a ton of movement, when they're going, and it depends a little bit on the pad and the thickness as well. But I would say that it would definitely, if you're getting a lot of shifting, especially the pads that slip back, then it's really worthwhile to look at the saddle without the pads on to make sure that it's the right thickness. Sometimes you need a little bit of a thicker pad to make the fit a little bit better. The Western saddles, we don't have as much to play with as far as redoing panels and reflocking things. So it's important to be able to, we rely a little bit more on pads for those saddles than the English ones. So that's kind of just